Welcome back to How America Got Rich. At the end of Part 2, we left off at the absolute peak of American dominance. World War II had forced the US to mobilize like never before. Industrial output literally doubled overnight, and by the end of 1945, the United States accounted for roughly half of all global industrial production. When the war ended, the US was completely intact with a booming economy, while the rest of the industrialized world was reduced to rubble. There was zero competition left. Almost by default, the US became the dominant military and economic power on Earth. But this time, America wasn't going to use the old imperial playbook of conquering physical colonies. Instead, it was going to build a massive financial and commercial empire. First, it provided absolute security guarantees for its allies. This didn't just create military dependence. It helped these nations establish the peace they desperately needed to start rebuilding. Along with the massive financial injections from the Marshall Plan, the US helped Europe get back on its feet, not just to stop the spread of the Soviet Union, but to create wealthy business partners and clients. You see, the US had huge surpluses of goods and desperately needed a global market to buy them. So the US Navy essentially became the ultimate protector of international sea trade. The US also needed other countries to lower their tariffs, so they pushed for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, forcing the world to open up to free trade. The final crowning pillar of this American century was the Bretton Woods system, which created a brand new international monetary order. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Every major country agreed to fix the value of their currency to the US dollar, and the United States promised to fix the dollar to gold at a stable, guaranteed price. Overnight, the dollar became the absolute anchor of the world economy, the one currency everyone could trust. To keep this massive machine running smoothly, the delegates created two brand new institutions: the International Monetary Fund to help countries defend their exchange rates, and the World Bank to finance global reconstruction and development. For an entire generation, the Bretton Woods system delivered exactly what its architects hoped for. War-torn economies rebuilt. Global trade exploded. Exchange rates stayed perfectly stable. And the United States, holding most of the world's gold and boasting the world's strongest economy, sat comfortably at the absolute center of the post-war order. With this system humming, the US entered the golden age of capitalism. Productivity surged and real wages doubled. Americans rushed out to buy cars, appliances, and televisions. This wild consumer spending officially replaced government war spending as the primary driver of the economy. Then came the baby boom. Between 1946 and 1964, 76 million babies were born, creating an instant massive market for diapers, baby food, toys, and eventually schools, fueling the economy for decades. The GI Bill also played a massive role here, sending millions of veterans to college and handing them the keys to affordable mortgages. Almost overnight, universities transformed from elite playgrounds into massive engines of social mobility. Add in the interstate highway system, the largest public works project in history, and you had cheap transport that essentially subsidized the creation of the American suburbs and the auto industry. Meanwhile, labor unions reached the absolute height of their power, representing roughly 35% of workers and earning them high wages, health benefits, and pensions. A blue-collar worker could now easily afford a middle-class lifestyle on a single income. Finally, government spending remained incredibly high, around 10% of GDP, funneling billions into aerospace, electronics, and research. That investment? It gave us the jet engine, the transistor, and eventually the internet. But by the late 1960s, this massive economic engine started to overheat. The grinding costs of the Vietnam War and President Lyndon B. Johnson's ambitious Great Society programs started running up the national tab. Add in the fact that German and Japanese manufacturing had finally recovered and were providing real competition, and US dominance began to strain. Then, the 1970s hit like a brick wall. During the Yom Kippur War, OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, slapped an oil embargo on the US and its allies for supporting Israel. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled from roughly $3 to nearly $12 a barrel. The US experienced severe energy shortages and gas rationing. Inflation spiked to 12%, birthing a terrifying new economic monster called stagflation. Stagflation meant high inflation and high unemployment were happening at the exact same time, something economists previously thought was impossible. Under all this pressure, the Bretton Woods system began to crack. As global trade grew, the world desperately needed more dollars in circulation, far more than the US could actually back with physical gold. By the late 1960s, the math simply no longer worked. Foreign governments were holding more paper dollars than the US had gold in its vaults to redeem them. Confidence wavered, and countries started lining up to demand their gold. Facing a devastating run on US gold reserves in 1971, President Richard Nixon pulled the plug. He officially suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. With that single, shocking announcement, the Bretton Woods system came to an end. What followed is the exact era we live in today. A world of floating exchange rates, massive global capital flows, and a US dollar that remains dominant not because it's tied to a shiny metal, but because the world still trusts the stability of the US economy. To stop stagflation from completely killing the economy, the US had to undergo a brutal economic regime change. It meant tearing up the New Deal consensus and building a new system obsessed with finance, technology, and global integration. Enter Paul Volcker, the towering chairman of the Federal Reserve. Determined to crush inflation at any cost, he jacked up interest rates to a punishing 20%. He intentionally forced the country into a severe recession just to choke out the inflation. It worked. But it came at a massive cost, bankrupting thousands of farmers and manufacturers who relied on cheap loans. Unemployment hit 10%, but inflation finally collapsed back down to 3%, restoring faith in the mighty dollar. With inflation finally dead, the stage was set for a radical new approach: supply-side economics, championed by President Ronald Reagan. Reagan brought a brand new theory to Washington. If you slash taxes on the rich and massive corporations, they'll invest that extra cash back into the economy, creating more jobs for everyone else. Once in office, Reagan aggressively deregulated industries and hacked the top marginal tax rate all the way down from 70% to just 28%. The result? The economy absolutely roared back to life in the mid-80s. But there was a catch. Thanks to that massive drop in tax revenue combined with skyrocketing Cold War defense spending, the national debt tripled. The deficit became such a glaring problem that Reagan actually had to quietly raise taxes again before he left office. Then came the 1990s. The US was finally reaping the benefits of that painful 1980s restructuring, just as a massive technological revolution kicked into gear. The personal computer and the birth of the internet created entirely new industries overnight. Productivity, which had essentially been stuck in the mud since 1973, absolutely skyrocketed. With the Cold War finally over, the US went all in on globalization. In 1994, they pushed through NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, stitching the economies of the US, Canada, and Mexico together. Now, this was great for lowering consumer prices, but it drastically accelerated the outsourcing of American manufacturing jobs to Mexico, and eventually, China. Still, the booming tech sector flooded the government with tax revenue. Combined with strategic spending cuts, President Bill Clinton managed to run the first federal budget surpluses since 1969. But there was a storm brewing. The aggressive deregulation started by Reagan, followed by the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act under Clinton, was about to come back and bite the economy hard. These moves allowed boring traditional banks to transform into high-stakes gambling casinos on Wall Street. This set the stage for the finance sector to become the absolute dominant engine of the American economy and planted the seeds for the devastating crises of the 2000s. The start of the century kicked off with a bang. Literally, the dot-com bubble popped. Throughout the late 90s, internet startups with zero profits and no actual business plans were burning through venture capital, wildly overvalued by investors. When the bubble finally burst, it wiped out trillions in paper wealth. To prevent a full-blown depression, the Federal Reserve stepped in and slashed interest rates all the way down to 1%. Then came 9/11 and the sprawling War on Terror, which triggered massive government spending, instantly turning the budget surpluses of the 90s back into deep deficits. But with interest rates sitting so low, investors were desperate for better returns. They found their new goldmine: real estate. Banks started handing out incredibly risky mortgages to people who clearly couldn't afford them, operating on the dangerous assumption that housing prices would just go up forever. Thanks to recent financial deregulation, this greed quickly morphed into outright fraud. Wall Street began packaging thousands of these garbage loans together into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities, and then sold them off to the rest of the world as perfectly safe, AAA-rated investments. But eventually, the music stopped. When housing prices finally fell, millions defaulted. The entire house of cards collapsed, dragging the global financial system down with it. Credit completely froze. To stop the bleeding, the US government was forced to spend nearly $1 trillion to bail out the failing, too-big-to-fail banks and automakers. Unemployment skyrocketed back to 10%. The 2010s were defined by a painfully slow, grinding recovery. How did they pull it off? A radical new monetary experiment called quantitative easing. With interest rates already pinned at 0%, the Federal Reserve invented a new tool. They essentially printed trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds, forcibly injecting cash into the economy to keep credit flowing. It worked to save the banks, but it came with a massive side effect. It wildly inflated the prices of assets like stocks and real estate. While traditional manufacturing industries continued to hollow out, Silicon Valley took over the world. Companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, Netflix, and Facebook became the new Standard Oil and US Steel, completely dominating the stock market and rewriting human consumer behavior. The very nature of work shifted too. The gig economy exploded. Platforms like Uber and TaskRabbit replaced stable, full-time employment with independent contracting, offering workers flexibility, but completely stripping away benefits, pensions, and job security. This era marked the final death of the old industrial economy and the absolute supremacy of the information age. In 2017, a political earthquake shook Washington. The government pushed through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, slashing corporate tax rates from 35% all the way down to 21% in a desperate bid to stimulate domestic investment. But why were they so desperate? Because for decades, a massive shift had been hollowing out the American heartland. As China rapidly integrated into global markets, it transformed itself into the undisputed factory of the world. Meanwhile, the US was pivoting hard into a service economy. As American labor costs climbed, it became vastly more profitable for US corporations to simply outsource their manufacturing to Asia. This relentless outsourcing contributed to the decline of labor-intensive industries. But as China evolved from just a cheap factory into a fierce, high-tech strategic competitor, US politicians suddenly grew terrified of their extreme dependency on Chinese raw materials and supply chains. This panic paved the way for an aggressive trade war. It completely shattered the fragile status quo of US-China relations. But here's the irony. It didn't exactly achieve its economic goals. China's trade surplus continued to shatter records, while the new US tariffs mostly just jacked up the price of everyday goods for American manufacturers, farmers, and consumers. The era of unquestioned, harmonious global free trade was officially dead. Despite this turbulence in 2019, the US economy actually hit full employment. But the celebration didn't last long. By early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered the sharpest, most violent economic contraction in human history. Lockdowns halted global commerce overnight, and US GDP plunged an unthinkable 31% in a single quarter. Learning from the painfully slow response back in 2008, the government didn't hesitate. They unleashed over $5 trillion in emergency stimulus. And unlike the bank bailouts of the past, this money was blasted directly into the bank accounts of everyday households and small businesses through stimulus checks and PPP loans. But there was a catch. When the economy reopened, Americans, flush with trillions of dollars in stimulus cash, all tried to buy goods like electronics and furniture at the exact same time. The global supply chains, still crippled by the lockdowns, completely buckled. This lethal combination of sky-high demand and broken supply caused inflation to violently spike to 9.1% in 2022, the highest in 40 years. To kill off this inflation, the Federal Reserve aggressively hiked interest rates, officially ending the long era of free money. The COVID-19 supply chain collapse also exposed a massive vulnerability: a crippling global semiconductor shortage. Suddenly, major American industries like automotive manufacturing and consumer electronics ground to an absolute halt, simply because they couldn't get their hands on tiny computer chips. This dangerous over-reliance on Asian supply chains forced the US government to completely abandon its old free market playbook. They launched a massive, unprecedented intervention. Through the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the government poured hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidies to physically rebuild semiconductor and green energy factories right back on American soil. The US had fundamentally decided that strategic independence from China was now vastly more important than cheap access to goods. The era of blind globalization was officially over. Heading into 2023, there were nearly universal predictions of a brutal recession. The consensus was that the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes, jacking rates from near zero to over 5% to fight inflation, would definitively crash the system. But instead, the US economy completely defied expectations and actually accelerated. Unemployment stayed historically low. Flush with excess pandemic savings, Americans kept spending, driven by a massive wave of revenge travel. Meanwhile, the stock market was being carried almost entirely by the Magnificent Seven, massive tech giants like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Tesla, driven by an absolute explosion of interest in generative AI. In 2023, AI felt like a novelty, but by 2025 and 2026, it became the structural driver of the entire economy. Massive investments poured into data centers and the energy infrastructure needed to power these huge AI models, keeping the construction and tech sectors booming. Early data even showed that integrating AI into software and administrative tasks was beginning to lift US labor productivity, allowing the economy to grow without overheating. The US successfully navigated the post-COVID crash, but it emerged fundamentally changed. A high-cost, high-investment economy burdened by a staggering national debt topping $37 trillion. By 2026, the United States finds itself in a kind of stagflation light, a sluggish economy suffocated by stubbornly high prices, even as headline growth technically continues. Inflation remains a persistent ghost. Food costs keep creeping up, and average monthly utility bills have jumped a painful 12%, tightening the vice on household budgets. At the same time, a dramatic shift in trade policy pushed the effective tariff rate from just 2% up to nearly 12%. More than half of those costs flow straight to everyday consumers, deepening the reality of a high-cost environment. The labor market is finally softening, with unemployment climbing to a four-year high of 4.6%, and labor force growth is slowing in unprecedented ways. Layered onto this is a striking, almost dystopian contradiction. Tech companies are planning an extraordinary $515 billion in AI-related capital expenditures, while shifting policy changes could leave roughly 5 million everyday people without health insurance. The result is an economy that looks great on a GDP spreadsheet, but feels increasingly strained for ordinary households watching the cost of living outpace their paychecks. Some people look at this and say the United States is teetering on the edge of a bubble. Others say the AI boom is just 1999 all over again. But here is the undeniable truth about the American economy. It is a resilience machine. It survived the starving times of Jamestown, the hyperinflation of the Revolution, the burning of the Civil War, the breadlines of the 1930s, and the complete banking collapse of 2008. Every single time, the bet against America failed. We shifted from tobacco to cotton, from steel to oil, from credit to silicon. Now, we are shifting to intelligence itself. The engine of empire is still running hot. And if history is any guide, the only thing more dangerous than betting on this economy is betting against it. Thanks for watching. If this journey from the post-war boom through modern financial crashes to the dawn of the AI era gave you a fresh perspective on America's rise as a technological empire, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.